O'Connell, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we are broadcasting live. Over to Paddy.
Hello, Happy New Year, everyone. Millie, thanks very much indeed. The last time I chaired the Syria discussion, Murray Colvin was downstairs, and she said to me afterwards, please make sure the Frontline Club keeps discussing Syria. It's a poignant thing to remember for me, I'm sure many of you in the room. And I know many of you in the room know more than the chair this evening, and it is appropriate to remind you it's a public meeting, and we do run these first Wednesdays with the audience in mind, not just the panellists, distinguished though they are. So I'd like to ask the panellists to introduce themselves and to give us a sentence or two about the subject this evening, which is, will 2013 see an end to the conflict in Syria? Beginning with Melissa, could you kindly introduce yourself and give us an answer to that question?
Yes, hello, I'm Melissa Fleming. I am the chief spokesperson for UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency. And in the Syria context, we are helping now 600,000 refugees in the 4 neighboring countries surrounding Syria. That number is increasing by 3,000 every single day. But it's even more dramatic, the people we're attempting to help inside Syria. I hate throwing statistics out at people, but it's a statistic that's quite shocking. There are 2 million Syrians. That's 1 out of every 8 Syrian has fled their homes. Many of them zigzagging across the country, running from place to place, finding shelter with a friend, with a stranger in an abandoned school, a makeshift camp. And as this conflict is reaching its 2nd year, the situation is becoming even more grim and reaching a stage where it could become, the suffering could become what we would say maybe colossal.
And 2013, will it see an end?
We hope so.
Right.
Because the only end is a political solution in our view, and the only end is a stop to the violence, and so people can return home.
Patrick.
Well, I'm a...
Patrick Seale.
I'm a writer, journalist, consultant. I've written a couple of books about Syria, including the biography of Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, who was the creator of modern Syria, ruled for 30 years. It's not an official biography. He banned it, which was great for its sales. Though I must say, when Jimmy Carter came on a private visit to Damascus, Hafiz al-Assad gave him a copy of my book, even though it was banned in Syria. Well, I share Melissa's view that there is no military solution to this conflict, and that the longer it continues, the more casualties and destruction there will be. There has to be some form of a political settlement. Now we can discuss, of course, how that's going to be.
Thank you very much. And at the back, are you hearing Patrick all right? Not really. Patrick, you're going to have to boom a bit. We'll come when you speak. Lift the microphone up.
That just works to
Maybe we'll give you a
broadcast.
hand microphone. And Ausama, would you kindly introduce yourself and similarly give us a sentence?
My name is Ausama Monajed. I'm a strategy consultant. I had a strategic research and communication center.
Speak up. You have to speak up as well, I'm afraid.
I have to shout then.
Yep.
I'm an executive director of a strategic research and communication center in London, and I work as a strategy consultant, and I've been advising the opposition on a few files, from the assets recovery to other issues.
Can you hear Osama at the back? Not really. Osama,
Still not really.
will you use your biggest booming voice to tell us? You told us you're an advisor to the opposition on some issues. Will you speak with this tone and tell the audience, will the conflict end in 2013?
Well, it really depends a lot on the willingness of the backers of both sides, and how far are they willing to risk creating a civilization in the eastern part of the country, eastern part of the Mediterranean. I can't shout at more than that.
Right, you can't shout. Well, we'll go soft when you do. But the answer is it depends on both the main protagonists.
Yes, supporters and backers. Iran and Russia on one end, Iran regionally and Russia internationally, and the entire rest of the world, obviously.
That's much, thank you, it's much clearer in every sense. And to you, John Lee Anderson, welcome. Sorry you're late.
I am too. And what is the question?
The question is, would you remind us who you are And would you answer the question, is the conflict possibly going to come to an end in 2013?
Hi, can you all hear me? Yeah. So I'm a writer with the New Yorker magazine. I live here in England, and I've been to Syria twice in the past year. Once in Damascus, reporting with a visa in the government's bailiwick in January, at the beginning of when things started getting, I guess, really bad. And then again at the end of the summer, August, September, when in Aleppo, when it opened up. July, August, actually.
Opened up to who?
Opened up to the opposition, I should say. So I reported there at the beginning, just after the beginning of the push on that city. Do I think that it can be resolved in 2013? Why not? The pattern is not good. I looked with some optimism at the prisoner exchange that was reported today. It's one of the very first agreements of any sort that's been reached between the two, but the pattern is actually towards more bloodshed. Killing logic is there rather than anything else.
Thank you very much indeed. So can I ask the audience to just take a brief question and answer session? If you think that President Assad will be there in 12 months from now, would you raise your hand? You think he'll still be there? So about a third of you. And can you keep your hands up, the third of you who think he'll be there? Do you think it'll make any difference if he's there or not? Keep your hand up if you think it makes a difference. So if Assad goes or Assad stays, does it make a difference to you who think he'll be there? So the same number. Right. Now let's just turn to you. You're nodding your head about Assad maybe as a man who makes a difference.
Well, I was merely nodding because I saw that in both cases it was a minority, in fact, of this crowd. Most people clearly have no way of knowing and aren't willing to vouchsafe a kind of insta-pundit guess on it. I'm loath to do the same, but since you ask, will he make a difference? Well, in the sense that I feel, again, it's pop psychology. He doesn't seem like the kind of guy who is going to take up a retirement offer in one of those dacha suburbs of Moscow. I think that there's a number of other possible tactics or ploys or means by which the regime can try to retain control or at least a place in the fight. And I see that as being the next on the agenda. There's always the surprise factor in a war. And that's why it's so difficult to call, and I think you can't really ever truly call it. It's like a mutating gene. And once it's out of the lab, it can go anywhere.
Let's
in July.
Let's ask the panel to discuss the present, starting for the next 10 minutes on the refugee situation and the current state of the regime. Melissa, will you outline for us the growing refugee crisis and where people are headed, and what happens to the people who can't get across the border, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, I gave you the kind of macro picture, but again, as I said, 3,000 people a day crossing borders. Most of the refugees, the biggest number are in Lebanon. Just very briefly on each country. In Lebanon, they're living not in refugee camps, but in host communities. That means that they arrive, they are actually, it's amazing how welcoming the societies are. The Lebanese government has decided not to go with an encampment policy, and that's the way decisions are made. Other countries like Jordan and Turkey do have refugee camps. In Turkey, the majority of refugees are living in 11 camps. In Jordan, it's 1. But there are many, many, many other Syrians who are living in regular communities and cities. And this conflict, because it's been going on for 2 years, many of them came out at the beginning with savings. Just imagine you had to flee London right now, and you have, I don't know, $50,000 in the bank, and you think, okay, this is going to end in a couple of months. I'm going to go visit my friends in France. But, after a while, after 3 months, 4 months, 10 months, 11 months, 2 years, your savings dry up. Your friends are getting maybe slightly tired of you. And Syria was a middle up class and well-to-do, for the most part, country, and there are many, many people like that. So we have groups of people in these countries who are now coming forward and saying, help me now too. So we're saying right now there's 600,000 refugees, and we believe there'll be 1 million by June if the conflict continues as it is now. It's a really, really tough situation. And last point, because I don't want to go to it, but the countries who are hosting these refugees are giving these refugees the gift that is the most valuable thing you can give somebody fleeing war. And that is an open border, that is shelter, that is school for their children. We're helping them do that, and dignity. And if for the people inside Syria right now who are not able to cross the border and whose lives are really under fire, it is a really, really, really desperate situation.
We're staying with the refugees, so if you in the audience wish to talk about this, please catch my eye. But can I ask you, Ausama, I read a report that if you stand at the border from Lebanon and you look towards Syria, you might get shot if you take photographs of government soldiers. Is that true? Have you heard that? And what's the risk of escalation by dint of being so close to the firepower?
I would even add to that Syrian troops actually cross the Syrian-Lebanese borders and they actually conduct operations on Lebanese soil and they go back. So it really happens in many incidents.
So do the refugees represent a humanitarian crisis and an escalation potential?
Yes, indeed. We have evidence of some, some cases where the regime went they crossed the border, the Syrian regime fighters, and they went into a certain house or a farm to arrest some people and just bring them back, Lebanese or Syrian, doesn't matter. So it really escalating, and that created that kind of tension in Beirut itself, in Lebanon.
Patrick, the refugees for you, do they have more than their own story? Do they have a sense of people who the regime want to get hold of, want to kill, or do they have the potential for being a future government, the people outside the borders by miles?
How many of you here have been to Syria or know it? Oh, quite a few. Quite a few. That's great. Now, as you all know, it's a rather strange country. It's a mosaic, a bit like Lebanon, of different communities. Now, about at least 30% of the population are not Sunnis, but are Christians, Alawis, Druze, Kurds, Ismailis, and others. So that third of the population is terrified of the thought of an extreme Islamist takeover of power. So on the whole, I would say very roughly that about a third of the population supports Bashar al-Assad, another third want to hang him, and the remaining third are waiting really to see which way the wind blows, but really also have a certain nostalgia for the past. Now, we mustn't forget that the Assad's father and son, particularly the father, was there for 30 years, son for 10 years. Now, before this present uprising, if you were living in Syria, you felt that you had a certain stability and security. You didn't have freedoms. You didn't have political freedoms. But if you compared to what happened in Lebanon, 15 years of civil war, in Iraq, hundreds of thousands killed in the civil war, millions displaced, Kuwait, Algeria, 200,000 people killed. At least in Syria, there was stability and security.
So I'm just interrupting you to ask, that as a member of the audience here wants to ask you about the refugee situation.
Right.
Hi, yes. I wanted to ask Melissa, when you said that the majority of refugees in Lebanon, they're not staying in camps.
You have to use the microphone, otherwise no one else will hear you.
About the refugees in Lebanon, you said they're mostly staying with host communities. I've just got back from doing work in Lebanon in the refugee camps, and in many of the Palestinian camps like Sabra and Shatila and Nahr al-Bared, there are hundreds of Syrian families who are not only living amongst Palestinian refugees, but a lot of the women whose husbands were fighters, or if they got separated from their family members have actually married into a lot of Palestinian families because of the mentality of safety and security. And given the recent involvements of Palestinian refugees in Syria with recent skirmishes, how do you feel this is going to affect the regional crisis?
Yeah, well, we're obviously concerned for these countries that this conflict, because of the mosaic that Jonathan so well described, and the issues with the Palestinians are also a group of Palestinians are hugely vulnerable inside Syria. And yes, they're not, in Lebanon they're called camps, but they're not really camps. They're sections of the city. We are very concerned about the fragility of a society like Lebanon, and the fact that this conflict is next door and has the potential to destabilize. I mean, we have in Jordan the economic and resource strain is tremendous. You have huge refugee flows into Iraq, a country that is having major issues with its own stability. So the regional dimension, and if this continues to go on, is of concern, I think, to all of us.
So I think we've heard there that it's growing, that it has the power to escalate. The refugees are both a humanitarian and a sort of strategic situation for us to consider. But I'd like to ask us all to move on to the state of the regime in the country now, and again with your questions. Would you, Ausama, Patrick, and then John Lee Anderson, would you give us a sit rep of the regime? Describe for us, compared to to where we were 6 months ago, how much in control is the core? Who is the core?
The regime is losing control on the territory every day. I would say they have control over Syrian territory about 60-70% during the daytime, and it drops to 25-30% only nighttime. That's quite dramatic.
Wow.
A lot depends on the air power because of that. And number two, we have to watch trends and patterns. The economy is deteriorating dramatically. The reserve is running out, and without the support and financial backing from outside, they cannot even pay civil workers. They actually are not practicing governance in most parts of the country, from the small issues of running schools and hospitals and collecting trash to maintaining order or running courts. And that's why we've seen an emergence of different structures, alternative structures of civilian councils that have emerged in every single province, that where people are electing or appointing or agreeing in a way to run their own daily lives.
As you were speaking, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and the regime can also has the ability to devolve into smaller regional mobile units. Warlordism, militias, local fighting groups that are loyal to it. I mean, that's that's something that you see in all sort of total war, and I see and Syria shows all of the hallmarks of having the potential to continue to acquire that sort of dimension, that sort of profile, the profile of total warfare, where the only logic is survival, outkilling your enemy, neutralizing him. It's an interesting regime in that despite this incredible loss of territory, which interestingly may not correspond in every place, but roughly, I guess, corresponds to perhaps the ethnic breakdown the sectarian breakdown in Syria. You say roughly 60-70%, which is approximately the population, the Sunni population, a little bit more in Syria. It's interesting. The regime may not be necessarily geographically obligated to a certain area, but have the ability to move at a certain point. I see the kind of imperviousness of its stance within the war as interesting, which is what I was about to say before. It was very rattled. It was very shaken in July when it had these these attacks against it, and the attacks came very, very close to Assad himself, the inner core of the regime. And there have been further blows since then, and a loss of territory.
Right. And
But
Patrick,
there's many weapons still in its arsenal, which has yet to use.
Patrick, would you tell us how much you think the regime is Assad at the moment?
Well, he is the front man of many national institutions of the state. The officer corps is one of those. It's a very powerful officer corps, about 200,000 brigadier generals. There's the civil service, about 1.5 million people. There's the networks of the Baath Party across the country. There are security services. Now, these are the institutions of the state. If I may just hold you for a second, if you recall when the Americans moved into Iraq, they disbanded the army and they outlawed the party. These were the two institutions of the state. What happened? The state collapsed, and you had a terrible civil war in which hundreds of thousands were killed and millions were displaced. A lot of them, several millions came to Syria. So most people who care about Syria are worried that that will happen in Syria too. And so they don't want that to happen. They want the institutions of the state to remain strong, and particularly the army. Now, I believe that both the Russians and the Americans have an interest in keeping the Syrian army intact, because they're beginning to worry at the rise of Islamic groups like the Jabhat al-Nusra, close to al-Qaeda, denounced by the United States as a foreign terrorist organization. You see, the situation has changed over the recent months. And increasingly, the civilian opposition, the so-called National Coalition, which replaced the Syrian National Council, now they don't seem to have any control over the fighters on the ground. The fighters on the ground are increasingly Islamic, the most extreme form. Well, this is one reason why the United States is holding back from supplying them. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why President Assad, in his latest speech a couple of days ago, he was trying to exploit this situation, that the West is worried now about the rise of the Islamists. On the one hand, there's not going to be any Western intervention. The rebels had hoped, had banked on a Western intervention, on the Libyan model. They made a huge mistake. So I would say that the military balance is still very much with the regime.
Osama?
Yes, I don't think the Baath Party is relevant in this case. A lot of the FSA fighters now are former Baath Party members. The Baath Party was only used at a certain stage. The Baath Party headquarters in different provinces to receive the intelligence and military orders, then distribute it to different fighting groups and militiamen, because they couldn't send to one particular security branch in that province. Obviously, security branches were not allowed to communicate before. And then a complete new structure emerged in the intelligence, or the way they conduct business. But the Baath Party is, I think, irrelevant, unlike the Iraq model. Now, I think the importance of Assad as a figure is to his supporters only. It's for the rest of the country or the state institutions, not really that important. He is the point where everyone is, or the banner that everyone is fighting under at this stage. And if he's taken away in any way, then his base of support would be fragmented significantly, even within the Alawite community.
And to you in the audience on Assad, to you at the back, I recognise you, but we can't. It's very dark, and we're bringing a microphone. So do tell us who you are. We're looking really here at the state of the regime, and then we'll move on to the FSA.
I'm Bill Neely from ITV News. I've been in and out of Syria for the last year 5 times. In fact, I'm going again on Saturday. And I am surprised that the same people that I deal with every time are still there, with the exception of Jihad Makdisi. And I wonder what the panel thinks. Why is it, I think I know the answer, but why is it that not a single artillery regiment has defected, not a single Air Force brigade or battalion of the army, or really senior people? Most of them are still there. And just a quick question on Jabhat al-Nusra, because there was a really interesting report yesterday from a think tank saying that this is a group that now consists of 5,000 members, responsible for the attack on army headquarters, killing Assad's brother-in-law, disputes with the FSA. I just wonder how strong really we think Jabhat al-Nusra is.
So can I take it in two parts? Let's do why no one's defected first, and then when we talk about the FSA in 1 minute, we'll talk about Jabhat al-Nusra. And thank you, Bill. Welcome. Let's have all of you reacting. Bill, you keep the microphone from old creatures in position.
Well, there have been very, very few defections. This is very important. The inner core of the regime remains strong. Now, this is because the Syrian army is an ideological army. I rather disagree with my friend here about the collapse of the Baath Party. Baath Party had its fingers right across the country, including in the army. The army was an ideological army. Now, what does that mean? It had a role, and its role was to contain Israel in the Levant. You see, to give you a brief history,
We don't want a brief history. We want an answer. We want to know why now. Why no, we don't. Why now is no one defected? You can go, Osama, because Patrick can't answer.
Not everyone.
No, you go. No, we haven't got time. We haven't got time. No, why is no one defecting now?
It's a wrong question because people are defecting every day, soldiers and senior officers. We're talking about the head of the military police.
One person.
Why is nobody talking about the sectarian?
You're talking about the head of the biological weapons program. You're talking about Manaftlas, who actually was the head of the 104 regiment in the Republican Guards. The
20 people then?
No, more than that, obviously. The officers are far more than that. But the question is why regiments are not defected and why entire units? Because we need to understand how the Syrian army was constructed over 50 years. And Patrick knows well how Assad the father spent almost all of his time worrying about the army, and that because most of Syria's trouble after independence came from the army, all the coup after coup after coup. The key thing was to neutralize the army and make it completely immune to that kind of, coup. The army, there are three leaders in every unit. There is the intelligence officer, there is the commander-in-chief, and there's the other technical officer is in place. Right. And one of them has to be an Alawite. And he is the one who is the last word, regardless of his rank. You would see a very junior Alawite officer walking by and a general, 3-star general, standing by, saluting him militarily.
Yes.
And Syrians, even soldiers, are really fed up with that. And so that's why there has been different construction of the units. Now, they do not send entire units in conflict zones or lines. They select different people and fighters who prove to be utterly brutal in many conflicts, and they send them from different units. That actually imposes a problem for them because they have different training styles, different orders to follow, and different ways of conducting operations, but they would take that risk and will incur losses rather than sending an entire unit, risking it will defect entirely.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear what Osama said because I wasn't as versed on the kind of internal makeup of the military. But when you're with the rebels, when you're with the opposition, the armed opposition, you're very aware that you're with predominantly Sunni people. They're constantly talking about the Alawite, the sectarian nature of the regime. When you're in Damascus, you never hear the word Alawite spoken. It's never mentioned. There's a pretension, which I recall from, it's a very Baathi sort of pretension, that this is a detribalized, secular, non-sectarian state. I remember it in the days of Saddam in Iraq. Nobody ever spoke about their sect. And of course, the minute the glue left,
this was a question. This was a question. Remember about why there haven't been defections from the army on a bigger scale.
All of the defectors I spoke to, which included rank and file soldiers and some officers, spoke of this figure of the intelligence man, whether it was Air Force intelligence or another, the Alawite, who prevented them or who ordered them around, who prevented them from operating. Even though
that's right. Now,
many of them were Sunni conscripts.
We interrupted you here with your history. Is this the point you were going to go on to make, that when it comes to explaining this question, there's a big culture which has been set up over 50 years? Would you like to pick up where you left off?
I would, if you would, if you would allow me. I mean, the first thing to remember, I think, and to note, is that there are very old roots to the present struggle, and the roots go back at least to the 60s, when the Baath came to power in 1963, as a secular Arab nationalist movement. At that point, Islamists went underground with their weapons, and they rose in the mid-70s and fought a terrorist campaign against Hafez al-Assad from 76 to killing many, many people, hundreds of people close to him, until he crushed them at Hama after they seized the city, and with about 10,000 dead. The black mark against the regime there was that many people were killed after the governments had seized control of the town. They brought down from their houses and shot. But that struggle against the Muslim Brothers then, and the Muslim Brothers were then outlawed for 30 years. Membership of the party was punishable by death. And so they seek revenge today against this regime. And it's an old story.
Patrick, we both know this has nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. The uprising is part of the Arab Spring. Who marched in Damascus March 15?
Excuse me, let me add one word.
Well, then he has to add another word back.
Of course, yeah. Look, this
has absolutely nothing to do with Muslim Brotherhood.
This is a complicated situation which really has to be...
We have all night.
Has to be explained, if you'll give us 2 minutes. Now look, this is a multi-stage crisis. Inside, Syria suffered the most terrible drought from 2006 to 10, the worst in hundreds of years. As a result, hundreds of thousands of peasants were forced off their land into a sort of poverty belt around the cities. They are part of the foot soldiers of the rebellion. Syria's population has exploded like in every other country, in every other Middle East country. Unemployment, there's huge pressure on all the government services. Schools and universities producing half-educated young men for whom there are no jobs.
Massive corruption.
So the urban unemployed, the disaffected peasants, these are the foot soldiers of this thing. Now, the Muslim Brothers, of course, seized on this, and when the Syrian National Council was created, they were the principal organ behind it. And indeed, it's their allies today, Jabhat al-Nusra and others, who are fighting the regime.
Okay. Right.
Jabhat al-Nusra is no friend of Muslim Brotherhood. Actually, they have their own battalions in Syria, like al-Farouq and others. But Jabhat al-Nusra, actually, they consider Muslim Brotherhood as, kafirs.
Okay. Now, with this
shorthand.
Right. But again, you're explaining why
there's lots more to say.
There is.
The ground was prepared and it was ripe. Yes. But this is a revolution. It's a popular uprising against a brutal dictatorship, part of the Arab Spring. That's how it started.
Pause there. But in terms of the regime and its strength, all of you agree, and in the audience, do you all agree that the strength that the regime have is as much due to Hafez al-Assad as to his son? If the regime has power today, it's not because of the eye doctor from 1 mile in that direction. It's because of 50 years of what his father did, building and merging the structures.
Absolutely.
That's what you seem all to be saying. And we've come for explanations.
Yes, the only standing institution in Syria, is the military/intelligence.
Which was created by the father.
Which was the main focus of Hafez Assad for all his life.
So the regime is still the father. The son is, broadly speaking, still an eye doctor from Paddington.
He's living out of that legacy and out of that, all these years.
No, and no.
I always find it interesting that he's always described as, and there was all of this shock that, how could he behave like this? He spent time in London.
Well, look at these people.
He was here for 17 months in his life. And I think it was here at St. Mary's, in fact, just down this, not a mile away. Wasn't that right? But anyway, maybe I'm wrong.
Patrick.
But, he was militarily trained. I mean, Patrick knows more about this
But
than
don't start Patrick again now. Because, Bill, did you
he's a military man who
Did you get an answer from the panel here? They're telling you it's a structure, it's a mixture of ideology with army structures built up over 50 years, and that's why you haven't had an artillery regiment dismantled. Is that all right for you?
Yes, I did. I mean, I think that's a good point.
Okay, so let's move on to the condition of the FSA.
He had a different question.
Yes, he did. Well, you can start us. The condition of the FSA. Would you like to start us, Ausama?
Again, they are gaining strength, obviously. Everyone was asking in the FSA, all units, for anti-armor and anti-aircraft missiles and defenses. Now they're not asking for that. Why? Because obviously they raided lots of air bases and they looted lots of regime stockpiles of weapons. We don't want to go into details, but that's what they are asking for is different kind of training now and intelligence training. And once you see many units created and bigger units created intelligence force, that means they move to a different phase of the conflict, where they can actually do intelligence and counterintelligence, and that's sophisticated.
Who are they? Who are they at the moment?
You have different groups within the FSA. You have the professional army folks and officers and soldiers who defected, and these are the most organized and the best to maintain territory and defend and provide services, because they follow orders and they have a military mentality.
1 in 10.
And you have, perhaps, then you have civilians who just pick up arms, and this is the most chaotic, which is the case, for instance, in Idlib and Idlib suburbs.
So they're not army, they're shooters, free Syrian shooters.
95% of the units in Idlib are civilians who just pick up arms, and it's very easy to smuggle arms because western and northern Idlib borders are with Turkey, and there are actually lots of farmers and peasants there, so they used to have weapons.
And are the Saudis giving them weapons?
No, I mean that's a big myth. 75 to 80% of the weapons in Syria, and I can go into details and numbers, we don't want to bore people here, comes from inside Syria from 3 different sources. One, from corrupt officers who sell it. Alawite officers selling weapons to the FSA. Another source is when they actually orchestrate attacks on checkpoints, they orchestrate it and they have a deal. You have a weapon worth $200,000, we're going to give you 100,000, we're going to orchestrate this, film it, blah, 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 you flee, you're not going to die, otherwise we're going to just attack you and kill you.
Patrick,
and the third is when they actually do operations and loot.
Right. Patrick, is the FSA fragmenting, and was it ever unified, and is it becoming more Islamified?
It was deeply fragmented from the beginning. Countless factions in there, no single commander, no single military structure. This is their weakness, and remains their weakness.
It's also a strength.
Well,
It becomes more difficult to annihilate a movement that is hydra-headed.
It's not a professional army, it's not an entity,
perhaps-
it emerged
perhaps,
spontaneously.
chaos theory.
Spontaneously.
Let me complete. From the beginning.
Not from the beginning, but just, but just make your point, and you uninterrupted, about who the FSA are.
From the very beginning, they depended and were hoping for a Western military intervention on the Libyan model. They have been deeply disappointed by that. And increasingly, the flow of weapons has dried up because people, the Americans and even the Saudis, are not terribly keen on putting weapons into the hands of the Jabhat al-Nusra and other extremists. And so they are short of weapons. And that's why there is a stalemate now. And that is why Bashar al-Assad chose this moment to make his speech, to say, we won't deal with those terrorists, but stretching out his hand to all those who have not taken up arms and who believe that Syria has to be protected and has to be rescued from this terrible, terrible war.
But allow me, you can't build judgments and conclusions and analysis on wrong intelligence and data. The fact or the assumption or illusion that weapons been pouring for many months and then now it's dried up is simply incorrect.
They have been.
Weapons, I can go with you in details, where they're coming from and how they, different, even the Turkish intelligence stopped many shipments coming in, and they did not allow that because, for various reasons, and they tried to organize things and it didn't work.
Let me say
most of the weapons come from inside.
Let me say that southern Turkey is crawling with officers from Britain, from France, from Turkey, training people.
But what's the percentage, Patrick? The percentage we're talking about.
Were you there? How could you tell?
Yes, I was there. I was there.
What is your percentage?
Again, I would estimate between 20 to 25% maximum.
Of what?
Of weapons coming inside, or kind of a proper training. Now,
But let Patrick finish, then we'll come back to the rest of you on the panel. I know you're staying out of the politics. Very wise. Patrick, we're on to the condition of the FSA, and then we're going to, I'm afraid, move on. Is it strong? Is it weakening?
Look, the situation is very, very briefly like this. The civilian opposition, now formed into this so-called coalition, has very little control over the fighting groups. Now, the fighting groups, made up of the different FSA brigades, but have been really upstaged by these much more efficient and much more violent Islamic groups who've been carrying out about 50 or 60 terrorist attacks in Syria, suicide attacks. And this is what scared the Americans. And this is what has stopped the flow of weapons to these people. And that is why there is a stalemate today, because the opposition, the armed opposition, is not getting the weapons it was hoping to get, and it's not going to get a foreign military intervention in its power. And this is what Bashar al-Assad is hoping to exploit today. He's trying to split the opposition and rally the loyalists.
Okay,
That's his strategy.
What's the FSA? The FSA is comprised of more than 370 units across the country. It varies in its training, in its weaponry and arsenal, in its discipline, and its ideological background. The FSA units in Damascus, including Jabhat al-Nusra units in Damascus, are completely different from those in Deir ez-Zor, for instance, or in Aleppo or in Idlib. Those who are conducting beheadings of Jabhat al-Nusra, those in Damascus do not approve of that. Their interpretation of jihad is different from those in Deir ez-Zor, for instance. Out of all these units, the different military councils emerged to unify or coordinate things like the ones in Damascus suburbs or in Idlib or the coastal region. And some chose just to remain on their own or just create their own merger business. Then you have, on the right of the FSA, you have jihadists, not freedom fighters. Jihadists who are, most of them came from outside. Again, what's the percentage? When we actually magnify this in the media, because it's a nice, interesting story, it's going to break the whole thing that we've been reporting about. But it's only a very tiny portion of fighters that came from outside or have this kind of extreme ideology.
Right,
and they're only able to flourish in certain areas.
But it's a fluid situation. What began in one way 2 years ago...
We can't mix Jabhat al-Nusra and jihadist fighters who believe in jihad.
No.
Believe either global jihad or local or regional.
You say we can't mix them, but we can say they are mixed. They are both fighting the regime.
It's very different.
The answer is yes.
No, you have, for instance, a unit X in Damascus. They know this is the unit that belongs to Jabhat al-Nusra. This is part of the military council of Damascus suburb,
but
which is an FSA.
They're all fighting.
Of course they are all fighting the regime.
Right.
That doesn't mean they're all mixing or sharing resources or planning jointly.
Okay, good. Now, Patrick, Jonathan Lee, and then to the audience.
Just one quick remark. Many, as you said quite rightly, many of these fighting groups are simply self-defense units in their various regions, recruited locally, protecting their own houses and businesses. They are quite different from armed groups who are moving all over the country, like this Jabhat al-Nusra and many others of that sort. And they are the ones who are really inflicting damage and are carrying out suicide attacks. And
how many suicide attacks?
About 60 so far, about 60.
Only 14, actually, and only a few of them were actually actual suicide bombers, and from certain areas and regions, and they are all above 23 years old.
Blowing up cars.
Yeah, again, but blowing up cars.
Directed at the security state in most cases.
Not someone walking in and blowing himself or herself.
All right, but now, just John Lee, if I can come to you. Here we see a debate about numbers, but can you just give us a summary from your perspective, and then we'll test it with the audience. The FSA, is it now a ragbag group of people who include politically motivated people and religiously motivated people and fractures within those two structures? Is it now more complex and evolving than when you were last there?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Thank you, and good night.
On the other extreme.
Next week's session.
Yes, I mean, yes, and of course there is an intelligence effort underway, which one isn't privy to, which involves the knocking together of heads on the ground, in the field, and outside in order to create counterpart, rival, allied units to groups like Jabhat al-Nusra. Until now, it's clear that the West hasn't felt comfortable in handing over sophisticated weapons for the reasons that we've been hearing about. That doesn't mean to say that there hasn't been a covert effort going on, which it's very clearly going on.
Right.
And so there's an element to this. There's an element to this which can't be quantified and can't be measured. As we're doing here tonight.
We're coming on to the position of the international...
surprise factor, going back to
We're coming on to the position of the international community. Would you like to round up the audience contribution on the FSA?
Can I launch it? Well, actually,
the two things play on each other. I had a violent argument in Voice of Russia with a man in Moscow who had a hell of a lot of conviction that anybody who opposed Assad was sort of completely insane. But there are civil wars going on all over the region, and there seems to be quite a lot of uncertainty on the stage as to whether or not there is actually an opposition to Assad that we know we can understand well enough to back it one way or the other. The question is, how much are the other regimes watching Assad and how this all plays out in terms of the civil wars in other states around there? I mean, every one of those states has a lot to analyze in this situation. How are they viewing this? Is Assad actually regionally trying to break the back of the opposition in the Arab Spring?
Right, can I take that as an opportunity to change tone onto the international community, unless there's anyone who's paid tonight and wanted to answer a question, a briefing on the FSA, which you haven't yet had? Right, so fine, we'll move on. No, I'm sorry, you were too late. So, no, we must keep it moving, but the international reaction, you've kept out of the politics. Would you like to give a view from the UNHCR on this? Because otherwise you won't speak until the end. But he's asking, how is the situation being watched as a way of dominoes falling or of structures destabilizing in other countries? Would you give us that answer, and then I'll ask others on the panel?
Just very, I mean, obviously being watched with grave concern, because the implications for regional peace and security, even global peace and security, are large. I mean, for our concern with the international community is financial. We need $1.5 billion in the next six months, and we need the world to step up to the plate for the humanitarian needs of the people. That's all I'm going to say, and I'll turn it back to the...
No, but before we do. Turkey wanted Patriot missiles, didn't it? Got them.
It's already run away. Almost.
So, I mean, that's not speculating, Melissa. To answer the question from the front, how are other regimes watching? In Turkey, the junction, apparently, between Europe and other cultures that aren't European, they want Patriot missiles in order to watch what's happening over their border.
Well, you know, there's rich history, and I'm sure our professor will give us a lesson here, which is not my job, but we would love to hear it. But
are you concerned about the prospects for escalation?
We are hugely concerned about I can represent the entire UN system right here in saying that we have all stepped up our operations to the top emergency level. Syria, if there's one conflict in the world, and there are many conflicts in the world that worry us, Mali, Sudan, South Sudan, to give two examples, but this one is the one that worries us most from the humanitarian perspective, from the suffering of the people perspective, because we predict that things are going to get much worse before they get better. We're predicting just large numbers fleeing, and the suffering, if we don't get the funds that we need to alleviate it. That's all we're there to do. I mean, this is our job.
Can you internationalise it? Can you internationalise it for us, as the questioner has asked?
Yes.
Would you like to start, John Lee, and then we'll come back to you, Patrick. Yeah. John Lee Anderson, the potential for internationalised conflict?
Well, yes. I mean, literally on every border, there's an aspect of concern. I mean, when I spent 10 or 12 hours in Turkish detention because they thought I was not a journalist, but working for some American agency. And what they really were concerned about was the American position vis-a-vis the Kurds. That's what they were very concerned about. That was kind of interesting. You know, despite my protestations to the contrary, no, I really am a writer. You know, yes, but what do you think about the Kurds? What is the American position on the Kurds? So there's a lot of that, and of course we're seeing Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan and Turkey and the Kurdish north of Syria all in a kind of newly effervescent, volatile stage. Depending on the way things go, we could see cross conflicts there. In the area of northern Aleppo that I was in, it was fascinating because of the kind of, I was talking about hydra-headed nature of the conflict as well, but literally every town and village was a kind of self-defense unit, sometimes based upon sectarian profile. And many of them were in sort of armed neutrality with one another, with a common enemy in mind, but that could change in the future. So there's a lot to grapple with. You mentioned Lebanon.
Yeah.
I know that Jordan is a state of it's a place that the international analysts are looking at with a certain amount of concern. That's seen as in a uniquely fragile state, and that could be seriously destabilized as a result of this conflict.
And Ausama Monajed, will you just talk about Russia and the United States for a moment?
Just quickly, I disagree with the term civil war. What's happening in Syria is not a civil war. It is a popular uprising. It is a revolution against dictatorship.
Well, it began that way, didn't it?
And I believe, we can go through the definitions, but it's still a revolution. Now,
but we've just described that the FSA is not a popular uprising the way it began. We've said it's got a religious element to it, and we've been through that.
The religious element plays a role in recruitment and keeping the fight going against a brutal dictatorship. But once that over, it's a different case. Now, I think the conflict completely, changed even internally or regionally a few months in 2011 from that kind of nature of a revolution into a struggle between two different axes. The Iran, Hezbollah, Syrian regime, one side, what we call the resistance axis, and Turkey, Saudi Arabia, GCC countries, and the Western allies in another aspect. And I think
that's where we are now.
That's where we are now, and it is very clear, very apparent. It's even it's simpler than the case during Lebanese civil war because we're more involved. It's here. It's very clear. Two axes. So one is going to back off their support to obviously whoever they're supporting and backing, and then or increase that, and we'll see different scenarios.
And bearing in mind, some of us have come for a briefing. We'll find out if it's controversial. Just spell out all the countries again in case we didn't hear. Who's on one side internationally and who's on the other?
Russia, Iran, China. There's perhaps internationally only countries on one side or with a significant weight, and the entire world is on the other side. And China would just follow suit, obviously. Russia. China is not going to veto, be the only country veto in the Security Council. It's Russia. And why Russia? You asked about Russia. Because Syria is the last entrance to the Arab world for the Russians.
Right, we're asking you in the audience if you agree with this, and on the panel, to you.
I'd just like to make an observation. I think we're 2 years plus into this conflict, and we're still procrastinating. What is it? What is it? The lack of urgency is frankly quite awful because 60,000 people have died, and what we should be here is discussing what can be done. What should the international reaction be?
Yeah, we are going to
one
do
last,
that.
But one last point. Ban Ki-moon, as head of the UN, he hasn't been featured nearly enough in the front pages, actually appealing.
Okay.
And that's disappointing to see from the organisation which has this mandate.
Right. I'm going to call you again when we get to that. But it's not helping all of us. We're just trying to limp through the topics on the subject, and it is difficult, and we want to discuss what will happen, but we just want to put to bed the position of the international community. And I will call you again on the question of what will happen. But in the audience, on the question of the international community, would you have a question for the panel? Do you want to challenge this view that it's 3 countries on one side and the whole planet on the rest? Would you like to challenge that position?
Definitely, because if it was black and white and there was, 3 countries on one side and the whole world against Assad, then Assad would have gone ages ago. He hasn't gone.
How?
It would have been maybe similar to the Libyan scenario. There was an international intervention. Assad is there,
Russia was on
and
board.
he's still quite strong. Russia is on board.
Yeah.
But
No, Libya was on
think
board. Russia here opposing the entire UN Security Council.
Yeah, but USA and Europe are stronger, I think, are more
Not
powerful
willing to
than
compromise
Russia.
with Russia on a deal that is more expensive than Syria itself.
Okay.
Possibly,
And
yeah.
you-
But I think another reason is the fact that we're misunderstanding the Arab world, which is predominantly Muslim. I mean, you spoke about the Muslim Brotherhood and the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood in the 1970s and early 80s, and you labelled them as terrorists. I don't understand how you reach that conclusion. There was this tiny splinter group from the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay. I'm going to have to ask you
who
not
took
now.
up arms against the regime.
Thank you.
But they were denounced. Can I just quickly add
It's
that...
about the international community now.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just think that in understanding the Arab world and the Muslims, we need to be very accurate in our definitions. You can't accuse the Islamists, all of them, of being terrorists. You just said it or the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood. You've got to understand the Arabs, the Arab societies, the Muslim societies. You said the religious element. Of course there's a religious element. Most of the Arabs in the Arab world are quite proud to be Muslim. They're not societies like here in the West, which have moved away from religion. So I think it's just about, checking our understanding of the societies in the Arab world.
Okay. Hold that thought, but because it will come back later. But there's a question here in the middle on the international community, and then about what can be done. I'm coming to the gentleman I interrupted.
Well, there are a couple of other countries actually that probably would back Assad. There's a whole South America. Venezuela has been really, really important with providing a lot of oil and all the rest of it. And also, I think to cast Russia as the great agitator, the great evil, is probably a little bit, of an oversimplification, just simply because it's actually probably Russia that's going to come up with the solutions to all these problems, because whether we like it or not, international intervention won't happen without a UN Security Council sanction, which Russia will need to give its okay to. But I would just add that the NCB, which is the national coordination body, the sort of secondary opposition group, which no one really talks about, run by Hessam Mana, may have some of the answers. I'm not saying it definitely does, but there are talks in Geneva on Friday, and if Brahimi's plan is going to work, it's going to need the Russians. And we talk about transition. Well, transition will need transitional government, and that is what the international community should be pushing for, a government, not just these random coalition bodies which don't mean anything. Because when we talk about the day after Assad, what will come the day after Assad? It will be a government, hopefully, rather than just coalitions.
And at this point, we're moving to future talk.
We have to just correct the facts again. There are lots of misunderstanding. Venezuela provided one shipment of diesel and then stopped because it was threatened by the US government that they will actually compromise and sanction its companies. So only one shipment of Venezuela. In Latin America, only one country that is sympathetic to Assad now, just in the rhetoric, is Venezuela, not even practically.
Cuba as well.
Cuba, perhaps. Yeah. And second, I said countries who actually with a significant weight or strategic importance to matter. I'm not, with all due respect, I don't know what Monaco's position, perhaps. But that doesn't really create a weight in the Security Council. So that's my my correction about NCPA. With all due respect, there's a irrelevant.
Look, there's one.
Because you're a member of the opposition. No. Because what's the weight on the ground, the size of support, even Khayyar. This is Khayyar, who are one of the executive members. With all I know the person and I carry lots of respect. Went to China on a visit and came back and imprisoned, and now he's in prison. Brahimi's plan, similar to Annan, I was betting on it in every media channel. It will fail miserably, and Brahimi's plan will fail miserably because he does not understand the essence of the conflict yet, or does not want to understand.
Patrick?
Right, there's one important aspect which we haven't yet discussed. You can't separate the Syrian crisis from the onslaught on Iran. You see, Iran is Syria's principal ally. There's something called the resistance axis. Iran, Syria, Hezbollah. Yeah. Now, the United States, promoted and pushed by Israel, wants to bring down that whole axis. It wants to bring about the overthrow of the Syrian regime in order to isolate Iran and prevent it, clip its wings, prevent it intervening in Lebanon, in the Palestinian territories. Now, some Arab states, Saudi Arabia particularly, and Qatar, share that view. They are frightened of Iran, particularly since Iraq has moved under Shia leadership. You see, Iraq used to be the counterweight of Iran. Now, when the Americans moved into Iraq, overthrew the state, the Shia, which the majority, took power. And so Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are now frightened of Iran, frightened of its domination. And so the Americans and the Israelis and the Saudis want to bring down the Iran and Syria and Hezbollah. Israel has tried several times, as you know. They attacked Gaza to kill Hamas. They attacked Lebanon several times. So this is the regional aspect, which is really more important than the local struggle.
Right, thank you. Now, to you, sir, who I interrupted, not you, I'll come to you second. Can we give the microphone back to the gentleman with the beard? Can I move on to what's going to happen? Will 2013 see an end to the conflict? Will you perhaps talk to Melissa a bit about your sense of urgency, and then let's talk about how the conflict might end? Pick up where you left off.
Right. Well, I think Ban Ki-moon, as your figurehead, needs to be more to the front, certainly in the international press, in appealing for what you were looking for, 1.5 billion, I think is what you said. And I don't understand why he seems to have taken more of a back seat. The UN is the only body, I think internationally, which people will see as a sort of playing a relatively impartial role, despite the failure of the UN Security Council and Russia and China to go with foreign intervention. So I think there seems to be a lack of urgency at the forefront of the UN, and I think that's disappointing, worrying, whatever you want to call it.
Well, I represent UNHCR, and we have been yelling and screaming as loud as we. It's obviously not echoing very loudly in the press and in the media that you're listening to. I mean, it's at least Syria is on the front pages. We are getting some coverage. I have to say, our key top #1 message is the suffering of these people cannot go on very much longer. I mean, when you meet, I met a little boy, and I asked him, you know, how are you, and do you still play with your friends? And he said, I don't play with my friends are dead. I mean, when you hear these kinds of accounts over and over again, I think that's one of the problems. I think the world is not hearing these accounts. They're hearing statistics, and they're hearing about this foreign war that is becoming extremely complicated and problematic and difficult, and if we get involved, even more problematic and difficult and scary. So I don't speak for Ban Ki-moon, I speak for the humanitarian community, and yeah, if you can help us make our voice louder, we'd be grateful.
So we're looking at how it might end in 2013.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask something about a different aspect of the broader UN work, which I don't think has been mentioned yet, which is the, I suppose, slim possibility remaining of a referral to the International Criminal Court, and what potential effect that might have in 2013, and in the absence of that, what effect the, I suppose, ongoing publishing of reports by the Syria Commission of Inquiry could have.
So you mean Assad named at the ICC?
Well, I mean, it would be a referral of the situation as a whole, so we would expect the ICC to go after all war crimes, crimes against humanity.
I think they have to go after named people at the ICC.
They do, but it wouldn't have to be exclusively
one
Assad.
person.
It could be the FSA as well.
I think the report is due of the Commission around the end of January, and they are actually interviewing senior people who and generals who recently defected just to get their written testimony, even under different, you know.
So the answer to the question is wait to the end of January to see what the ICC says.
Not actually, it's the Commission Syria, Inquiry Commission.
Okay, and to you.
Again, on the international community response, I'm an economist myself, and I think, I mean, 1.5 billion, frankly, for looking at the situation is just nothing compared to, if you want to think about the implication, the longer-term implication of not looking at not the immediate humanitarian needs, but really looking at the accompaniment. How do you prepare these people back? How do you build state institutions in the countries that you mentioned are fragile in order to basically... So the question is, I mean, why is the international community only always so myopic, looking at the immediate thing and not really looking a little bit, learning from other post-conflict situations, whereby we've seen that if we don't plan for the medium term, we are likely to fall into a recurrence of conflicts in very fragile states like Lebanon, Syria, and in this particular
Okay, we'll fold that in.
Excellent
We'll
point.
fold that in here. You on there, and then you, sir, with your hand up. And we would like to look forward at this point, if you don't mind, to how the conflict might be ending.
In terms of how it might be ending, I think, unfortunately, it's going to be bloody, terrible, but it will end. And I think I've noticed a theme here tonight, and it's quite frequent in the media. There seems to be a kind of a clash between an internationalist view of how to deal with what's going on in Syria, and between the actuality, which is that it is a very realist, zero-sum game. In terms of the Middle East, in terms of even the world politics and what's going on in the world today, we're actually closer to the politics of 1939 than 1945. And the only person who seems to understand that and is operating on that principle is Assad. And he's fighting, and he's going to fight to the end. And that's the end of it. I don't think there's going to be an international community to help. In fact, what is the international community if not the sum of its parts? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree very much with your remarks, because I think we've seen here, where is the UN? Of course, and I'm making a distinction here between the humanitarian part of the UN and the political part of the UN, which has been hamstrung. Why hasn't Ban Ki-moon been more to the forefront? Because he has no street cred. Nobody's giving him any respect whatsoever. That's why you have this this new role of the Grand Vizier plenipotentiary who gets sent out. First it was Kofi Annan dragged back from retirement, and now it's Lakhdar Brahimi, who's a more level-headed, I think, serious player. He's a serious guy, but it's clear that that in all of this, the UN is being led once and again back to the feet of Sergei Lavrov. The very people that have vetoed all of the Security Council resolutions from the beginning and thwarted the international community from actually acting in a diplomatic or political way, in any way that's serious, and for that matter, coming up with funding, it's because the Russians are calling the shots. Okay, and they will at the end, and that's where we are now. In terms of when it goes beyond the battlefield. But that's right. On the battlefield, it's absolutely zero-sum game. This is total war, and that's the logic there. And we haven't seen anything quite like this for some time.
And let's make predictions now, and what will happen. You, sir, you've got the mic.
Yeah.
Do introduce yourself if you like.
Yes, indeed. I'm the former intelligence analyst in UK Customs Service for the ex-Soviet countries. So some of my points here on arms issues and the fate of that in relation.
You have to use them.
Survival of the army and the role of the army is based on that. I would just say that I would respectfully suggest that the gentleman who made the comments about Venezuela as a supporter, it may be the case that its direct support has been very limited, relatively limited, but I would suggest that as an insurance policy for the regime, the gentleman's comments need to be taken very, very seriously indeed about Venezuela. I think he's spot on. I would suggest that a way forward and some issues that really need to be looked at are based on comments the panel have made, is to offer the army a deal. They can keep some of their position and equally at the top some of their great wealth. You mentioned corruption and selling weapons. In return for a self-interested deal with the West, not to let large amounts of pretty advanced conventional weapons get out to people who will pay a hell of a sight more for a lot more modern and more well-maintained equipment.
And with respect, you're still talking in terms of the West offering a deal to the army in Syria. You still see this as a bunch of Westerners telling the Syrian army how to make a deal. You don't think there's an internal solution coming?
No, I would see that as being done with the opposition. I don't think it's necessary.
The West plus the opposition. Okay, let's talk about that. Patrick, the questioner is seeing a solution in this year between a bunch of Westerners who can't agree and a bunch of Syrians who can't agree. What do you think?
Is that a question?
Yes.
Or a statement?
Well, my view is that there is no military solution to this conflict. It has to be a negotiated solution one day, sooner or later. I was very struck by a phrase used by the Norwegian foreign minister, whom I saw recently. He said, "Dialogue is the strategy of the brave." Now, what is necessary, what is required, is that the United States and Russia and other countries should join forces and impose a ceasefire on both sides as a preliminary to a negotiation. They've got to be brought to the table. Now, there are quite a lot of people in Syria who would be quite happy, in my view, to talk to this regime. Now, Bashar al-Assad is not going to stay forever. Of course not. No regime stays forever. But there has to be a negotiation. There has to be a peaceful settlement. Otherwise, whoever wins this conflict will inherit a field of rubble. I mean, the killing has to stop. The destruction has to stop. And the only way to do that is by a negotiation. The rebels are not going to be able to defeat the government, and the government is not going to be able to defeat the rebels.
Do you agree with that, the rest of the panel?
No, I disagree. I think there will be no negotiations until one party thinks that they can, have enough cards to play on the table. Otherwise, if the rebels stop now, Assad will regain, obviously, strength and recover quicker than the rebels.
So you're in favor of more killing and more destruction?
No.
Yes,
of course, I'm saying what the people are thinking on the ground. That's what they are thinking. We are in favor. We are in favor of a solution. There has been several attempts by different countries to guarantee safe exit for Assad, to leave, and to start a process, a political process.
The great majority of the population want the end of this killing. and they want to return to something like a normal life. It is the extremists on both sides who have to be excluded.
Yes, but in practicality, how would you impose that?
How do you impose an order in the midst of a dynamic war?
Okay, to the audience, do you agree, sir? Do you agree with this, that it won't end by a military way?
Well, what I was going to ask was, I don't see it necessarily ending very soon at all, and that we might have to take a very negative view and look at a really long-term period of bloodshed of one sort or another, like Somalia or Lebanon. Whether Assad goes this year or next week or not, that it's clear that the opposition, militarily and politically, is so fractured that whatever happens with the regime, it's going to be a complete mess, and it could go on for a long, long, long time. And in terms of the international community, the stalemate we have now could be as good as it gets for them for a while.
And do you, when you hear the panel disagree on the question of a military or a negotiated end, have you come to an opinion about which it might be?
Well, it depends what you call a military end. I think people are going to be fighting and shooting each other for whatever minor cause or lesser cause they have for a long, long time.
And many of us are here for a briefing. Is the regime too weak to defeat the opposition, and is the opposition too weak to defeat the regime as we stand today?
Yeah, probably so. I think it'll be a war of attrition for a long time. But just to add to that, I thought that if anybody actually watched Assad make his speech last Sunday, he didn't look like a deluded man.
Or a defeated man.
Or a defeated man. Compare him to Gaddafi's speeches when he was going. He looked fairly confident.
To you, sorry,
yeah.
To you, sir, with the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, there are two things that are worrying me a lot about this discussion. One is that when the panel come back to the question of whether or not it will be a negotiated or a military solution, there's an insidious suggestion that somehow this regime is not appallingly savage. And I think that's pretty appalling, that there's any question that this regime should be tolerated in the long run. I think we should get back to reality. This is the regime which has savagely killed teenagers who are completely innocent in Deraa. And it's done things which are appalling. And the idea of a negotiated settlement with anyone like that seems to me to be a rejection of all the principles of the UN. But the second question is, I really dislike the dichotomy of a military or a negotiated solution. If we had a negotiated solution, so-called tomorrow, 60,000 people would have been killed. That's not a peaceful solution. It's already an appallingly bloody solution. So I think we'd get real about some of the rhetoric.
Right. And yeah, I'll come back to you. Let the panel react to that. So, I mean, here we are sitting in London, sort of with chess pieces. Patrick, we can all have a go. Right. Patrick, do you recognise yourself in that criticism?
Not really. You see, this figure of 60,000 has been bandied around. It's not the regime that's killed 60,000. Both sides, neither side can claim the moral high ground. Both sides are killing. Both sides are destroying. Now look, the thing is this. Any regime, whatever its political coloring, will not tolerate armed uprising on its territory. Now, you had some riots here in England. Had the rioters taken to arms, don't you think the British Army would have been on the street the next day? Of course it would. So you see, so long as the rebels occupy residential areas, of course the regime is going to flush them out and use heavy weapons against them. So, but look, I believe that Bashar al-Assad has made grave mistakes right from the beginning. He resorted to live fire right at the beginning. Great mistake. He lacked political imagination. He should have exploited the Arabs, the Damascus Spring right at the beginning. He didn't do so. But don't forget that his mindset was obsessed with foreign conspiracies. He's had a whole series of foreign conspiracies to deal with. Take the invasion of Iraq in 2003. If the Americans had been successful, Syria would have been the next target.
And in which he was heavily involved in helping back insurgents.
Of course he was. Of course he was, to save himself.
And from the questioner, he's angry at this sense of kind of allowing a negotiated
Again, we have to correct the figures. Allow me, please. I mean, 61,072 people as of midnight last night killed by the regime.
Oh, come on.
We have lists of names, surnames, last known location, all of these details.
There were tens of thousands of soldiers who've been killed.
No, the soldiers have been killed are 6,000 something by the FSA, by the way. We have the figures. Now, let me just...
All the figures produced by the opposition are all false and all propaganda, including the chap in...
Including those adopted by the UN. Now, the UN figures are false.
May I just jump in here? I think that when I hear Patrick speak about there's this idea of original sin. I mean, it depends on, there's the old glass half full, glass half empty sort of way of looking at things, and you seem to take the original sin lies with those who started the conflict against the regime, and you've explained a lot that we should understand about the regime's excesses and the reasons for which it behaved the way it did. But I think we will find, and we have found, the most credible of the reports I've seen suggest that an appalling number of people have been killed, as you say. I think it's more in the region of 10, maybe 12,000 of killed, of the regime's soldiers and intelligence people killed. Who knows?
Massacres
it's a small.
Massacres on.
No, it's a small number.
Let me go back to
out of the.
I want to go back to the gentleman who asked
70 to 80% of the people killed have been killed by the regime.
All right, are you here? Is this making it worse for you?
I'm deeply relieved there is a discussion of this now, because I think it's felt to me like it was a bit two-dimensional until recently. But there are two things I'd like to say. One is I have a horrid feeling that Patrick Seale would have been an apologist for Stalin if he'd been speaking 60 years ago. All that worry about conspiracies, all that concern about international, and that you could, as Stalin said, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic.
Okay.
So the risk is this is becoming a statistical discussion and not a discussion about right and wrong.
You have to give me a chance.
I would like to. If you'd like to let me open my mouth, I will ask you, would you like to respond to the accusation that you're an apologist for Stalin?
Of course I would like to answer that thing. I am an apologist for nobody, absolutely, and certainly not for Bashar al-Assad. I mean, I think he's made terrible, terrible mistakes, but so have the opposition. So have the opposition. They rose because they thought that the West would come in and topple Bashar. They were wrong. They were absolutely wrong. That was a major mistake. Now, they've never managed to get together. They've never managed to produce a coherent leadership. They've been guilty of massacres, as the regime has also. Now, the thing is this. You also have to understand that a conventional army faced by a guerrilla war is at a great disadvantage. It has to use its heavy weapons. What do you expect them to do? Give up? Put their head on the block? Right. Don't forget, the situation is one of kill or be killed.
Let's ask the audience.
And one last word. That's why I raised the question of the Muslim Brothers in 1982. They want revenge. They want to hang all these people. And what do you expect the regime to do? Surrender?
We know they're not doing that. To you in the audience. Over to you. Your moment.
Thank you. I wouldn't question also that the opposition made many mistakes, but I think we have to recognise that part of the reason the brutality of the opposition these days is because of the savagery of the regime. What started as a peaceful war, as a sort of uprising, became necessarily violent. But I'm wondering,
for about 5 days.
But because of the fact that this violence has now occurred and Syria is not going back, I'm wondering, mostly from Ausama, how is there any prospect that there will not be the kind of retribution or de-Baathification? If there is a negotiated settlement, how can we guarantee that there's not going to be mass kind of fissures opening up against the former regime?
Okay, we have to just go briefly and understand how many thousands killed by regime forces and intelligence before a single stone thrown at Bashar Assad's forces. Even those who were handing water and roses and peace. We forgot that this was a peaceful demonstrations in the streets. This was a peaceful revolution for many, many months until Bashar Assad ordered the army to kill and shoot and shell indiscriminately in the streets. There has been so many thousands killed without a single stone thrown.
And this
but then what do you expect from someone who's sitting at their homes, waiting for their wives to be slaughtered, for their kids to be killed, and for their daughters to be raped, and just sit arm folded waiting? Of course they're going to pick up arms and defend until the last breath.
And the gentleman at the back is nodding. He wanted the element of the severe brutality brought to the panel. He's not. It is being. But in the time that is left to us, we're trying to ask you all with different views to take us towards an end point of this killing in 2013. Our friend here is asking us, after a negotiated settlement, can you just tell us all, with your differing views, if she's correct to talk about a negotiated settlement? Would you, Ausama, like to address, will there be one?
The realities on the ground is that the FSA and whoever fighting Assad think that the trend is on their favor. They are gaining more territory, they're gaining more strength and more organized. They are seizing, a historic opportunity.
So
they can close on Assad in Damascus.
So no.
Assad thinks that he is losing. I think his last address or speech proves that he actually started to consider things. Otherwise, he would have never said.
But your briefing for us is no negotiation yet.
Not what I want to be. I think I'm talking about what the reality is on the ground.
No, there
won't be.
Right, to the audience. So it's got 10 minutes left. To you, sir, with your hand up. Then to you at the front. You've had a go, but I'll come back if I can.
Listening to this, I'm absolutely sure it will not end in 2013. And I have to say, unfortunately, I would ask the question, will it have ended by 2015?
Do you think it'll be a military end? Do you back the consensus in the room? Neither side can yet defeat the other militarily, thus we keep going.
Yes, I do back that, and I think it'll have to get a lot worse before you'll get sort of a superpower either agreement on something, or more likely one of the superpowers will be driven by their electorate, say a Western power, America, whatever, who will use drones or whatever to really make the impact to stop it. But, this is going to be a tragedy.
What makes it worse?
It is a tragedy.
It is, yes, but what makes it a worse tragedy? The introduction of new weaponry or greater numbers killed by conventional weaponry?
There's no easy and quick solution. Listening to the different views and the different interests, not that I understand it all, but I'm sure that there's no easy or likely to be quick solution. It will take superpower involvement.
Right, okay, to the audience, you're coming next. To you, sir, then to you on the front here, and then to you at the back.
Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. Now, I can't really contribute very much specifically on Syria or the situation, but I can say a little bit about the wider international issues. Question, where do all the weapons come from for all the parties concerned? In July last year, there was an international conference on a global arms trade treaty. It actually completely failed and couldn't reach any agreement whatsoever. The actual draft treaty was a pretty weak one anyway, but they couldn't even agree on that. And the fact is that if all the powers concerned had actually carried out their agreements, or many agreements over the years, from the beginning of the United Nations to control armaments, then we would not be in this situation.
And Frank, you've given your life to world disarmament. Might this be a use of chemical weapons by a leader against his own population?
Well, it's possible. I don't know. As I say, I can't really say very much about the specific. But the only other, I would make one other point.
Briefly.
That the vast majority of conflicts end up in negotiation in some form or other, even though in many cases all the parties are pretty obnoxious. And we have to recognise that.
And to those of you in the room who don't know, Frank's been fighting for dialogue since he was pushed in by his mother in his pram at in the 1930s. So, to you at the back. Well, 1940s. To you at the back. No, you haven't got a microphone. You can't speak. So, yes, to you, madam. Please use the microphone, or we'll take it away.
I wanted to.
No, please use it like this.
All right. I wanted to ask the panel about what I guess I'd have to say is the PR side of this. We keep talking about the rebels. No one in the outside world, knows a figure. Where I know it took many, many years for the Palestinians to develop an international campaign that has greatly aided them. And I'm just wondering if you think there's any hope, if this thing drags on, if someone from one of the rebel groups, it could be a singer, it could be a poet, it could be one of the defectors, it could be Jihad Miktasi, who was, the foreign spokesman. But the world has to see a campaign.
A figure.
And somebody should be here tonight from Syria, a Syrian who could talk You are Syrian. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't get that at the beginning.
No, it wasn't explained. It's a fair point. But in Egypt, they had a bunch of people, actors, singers. Women were allowed briefly to have a role on the streets. They didn't have one person. Now it's the army running it again. That's sort of the thing you're saying. Syria's lacking any kind of front person recognised by...
And what I...
We had that.
But what I want is
demonstration.
what I want is someone, ideally a Nelson Mandela type figure, but who's traipsing around European capitals, and even in the States, most people have never met a Syrian, and they need someone for credibility and for fundraising for your organization.
To all of you on the group, one of the problems in 2013 is we don't know who the hell you all are, and what do you think about that, writing for the New Yorker?
Well, it's an interesting thing that in these post-dictatorship situations, we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it in a number of other countries post-Gaddafi, in the wake of very, very charismatic or very all-encompassing cults of personality or powerful families. In the case of the Assads, it's very difficult to they atrophy. The effect on the intellectual and political discourse in the country is to suffocate it, and so you do have a kind of vitiated opposition. There's not a full ability to exchange ideas. We've seen this very much in Libya. There's an inability for new leaders to truly emerge and to grapple with the vacuum left behind. This is, I think, the nature of what happens when absolute power disappears.
Osama and Patrick and Melissa, and then your closing thoughts are coming up. I'll dip in the audience in the
I
middle.
would just agree with John here. After 50 years, the main objective also, again, of the Assad, which is to eliminate any threat coming from any kind of social or economic structures that would impose, including charismatic leaders or figures. But again, in the Arab Spring, people are fed up of these charismatic figures, are fed up. They are rising against these one all-knowing, all-leader, charismatic. They want just ordinary people who can elect and just kick out of power and just elect another people, just like anyone else.
Although they tend to be men that they kick out, don't they? Men replaced with men.
No, in the contrary, the vice president of the Syrian opposition coalition is a lady.
Well, we don't have to look very far. There aren't many in Libya. There aren't many in Egypt. The democracy that the...
I can only speak...
Maybe I'm wrong. Well, I don't know that there are many women around the rest of the Arab world running anything. And oh, it's untrue. There aren't any in Westminster. But would you like to comment? I know you're angry now, but I'll give you the microphone. But would you like to comment on the question of a figurehead for in the West, recognised in the West? Would you like to pass the microphone down to the end?
Doesn't vote.
No, all right. So, would you prepare your closing thoughts? Just go back to the audience. Would you like to just finish us up on this question of 2013?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about an ending. Asking the panel. I've read a lot about the red line and the nuclear threat in Iran. Do you think that an Iran-US face-off could overtake the end of a war in Syria?
Well, does anyone want to take that?
Overtake the end of a war? I'm not sure.
I mean, could the war be continuing in Syria? And worries about Israel and Syria and that situation with that axis, Iran and US, could that actually become the bigger problem that we should be talking about?
Well, you've sort of touched on the kind of perfect storm scenario, yeah. But as you can see from the Obama administration, they're loath to take any steps that would accelerate the standoff that exists currently between the United States and Iran into a military situation. That is the farthest thing from their contemplation. They are trying to avoid that in every way possible.
Thank you.
We talked about a war of attrition, and you talked about how the regime, you say, are killing a lot more people than the rebels. I'm just wondering, is that because of a lack of will or because of a lack of means? And, the regime do have the military advantage. How do we know if the rebels do get these much greater capacity weapons that we won't see much greater massacres on that side?
The answer is very quick, if you allow me. The regime's objective is to kill as many Syrians as possible. The FSA fighters' objective is to kill as many of the regime fighters who are killing people as possible. It's a completely different mentality. The regime is bombarding, shelling indiscriminately towns, villages with chemical weapons, with gas, all documented now, thankfully, on YouTube. They're using MiGs, air power. Well, the rebels are using AK-47 just to kill whoever is coming to commit massacres. They're completely different mindsets. It's not like two sides, classical warfare. No.
Patrick?
Well, I'm slightly more hopeful than some of the others for a number of reasons. First of all, I think that Brahimi, Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN envoy, as you know, has been working very hard with the United States and Russia. Now, the United States and Russia have certain things in common. They don't want this killing to continue, and they don't want the Islamists to win for their own reasons, which we can go in greater detail, and they want the Syrian army to remain a powerful force, if only to confront the terrorists and the extremist Islamists. So there is a chance, and some of you may know that in June last year, there was an agreement in Geneva whereby they did agree to try and impose a ceasefire on both sides. You see, the Western powers were rather hypocritical.
Assad dismissed it.
Excuse me.
Entirely.
Excuse me, he did not. The Western powers gave lip service to Kofi Annan's plan, but went on arming the rebels. You can't ask one side to cease fire and not the other.
Okay.
So I believe, just to sum up...
You have another summing up coming.
Right.
So thank you for that. I understand you dispute what happened in the past. We're just going to the audience about 2013, and we'll come back to you in the panel about your predictions.
Okay, I'd just like to say that I'm a bit more optimistic about 2013 and not 2015, as a gentleman in the back suggested, or 2050 rather. And it's because I would like to appeal to the common sense and perhaps the academic and perhaps the human responsibility that someone like Patrick Seale should have in recognizing that this is in fact a mass uprising, and there seems to be a tendency in the general discourse about the Syrian revolution that this is a secular Baathist regime fighting Islamic fundamentalists, which is totally incorrect. And of course I invite you to look at the data that the opposition has produced over the last couple of years and to recognize its validity before dismissing it.
Can you put it in your closing remarks? Okay, thank you very much. Put them in your closing remarks. You've had a statement. You have not. Would you like the final word as a member of the audience, and we'll go to the panel for closing thoughts. We're still looking ahead here, of course.
Sorry, I'm just going to make a quick comment, a few comments actually. In terms of the end of this conflict, this is a conflict that's happened to be between the Syrian government, backed by, unfortunately, the Russian weapons, and between the rebels, who are unfortunately backed by only the words and the support of the West, without actually the West trying to help them through weapons and militarily. As long as it's going to continue to be like that, unfortunately, I won't see an end to this. Now, in terms of talking about Patrick, talking about the extremists, see what happened in Syria, unfortunately, and the West helped contributing to this. When I lose my friends, my families, my whole neighborhood, and people are being massacred in Bab Amr, in Homs, in Aleppo, in Latakia, in Damascus, and the West goes on and do not put an end to this, people lose hopes, and people start to look for other ways to find hopes. And what happened in a region that is culturally built on religion, they look for religion, they look for God, and that's why you find some elements of the rebels who are actually turning into an extremist. And unfortunately, the West helped in supporting this. Now, just want to make a quick comment. If you believe in democracy, and you believe in democracy is priceless, and there's a cost to it, unfortunately. And the world works based on costs and benefits. It's going to be very costly to get democracy in Syria. But if you believe in it, you need to support it. In terms of Bashar al-Assad and his regime, Bashar al-Assad and his regime are cancer. They are cancer to Syria. And in order to get rid of cancer, you need to destroy the cancerous cells. This is the only way if you want to get over and get democracy and get rid of the Syrian government and regime, by destroying the cancerous cells. Otherwise, as long as you think about a negotiated settlement, a negotiation between both sides, this conflict is just going to continue on, and there's going to be a solution, unfortunately, at the end of it.
Can I ask you to just, excuse me, I think you've just told us you lost members of your family. Is that what you've told us?
Well, long-distance relatives in the family.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. One comment from the gentleman at the back who's not made a comment. Sorry, you have in front there.
Yeah, Paddy, just a quick question. Just thinking about looking ahead. Jordan, 23rd of this month, elections. We've seen there the last 6-8 weeks after Friday prayers, much more people on the street, not just questioning the government now, but questioning the king. Do we think we are going to see people looking at what's going on north of Jordan on the 23rd and thinking, right, this is going to make a difficult time for the elections on the 23rd.
Okay, so let's come to your closing remarks, and will you include a reaction, if you know one, about Jordan? The question that brought us all here was, will 2013 see an end to the conflict in Syria? Could you wrap together what you've said or what you didn't say, and we'll go in the order that, starting with you, John Lee, if we can.
As I said before, Jordan is a fragile state, and this situation in Syria only increases its fragility. It's been a steady process since the Iraq War, and I think Abdullah is vulnerable, by intention or not, and it could be external players. In terms of Syria, I tend to think that the war is going to intensify and continue in the pattern we've seen for the very reasons that Osama and some of the audience have mentioned, that it's a dynamic situation. Both sides feel that they still have a means to fight, and therefore that logic is what calls the day. There may come a moment in which we see a situation in which Assad sees a reason to alter his stance, or possibly the opposition, but the opposition is so hydra-headed that looks difficult at the moment. Like I was saying earlier, there's a submerged part of this that we can't truly calculate and analyze, and that's what's going on behind the scenes within the opposition. And for that matter, with the Russians and with Assad, there could be other calculations there. We may see some of those calculations emerge. I tend to think, though, and looking beyond the end of the conflict, which 1,000 Syrians have died, or 20,000 more, we don't know. But more will die. And in the end, there will be a new Syria of some sort. And it may be a Syria unlike like Libya, like Egypt. What we're seeing in the Arab world is a kind of, the new normal is instability. It's endemic. It's a kind of a chronic instability, which is not grounded in the kind of typical. When you're agitating.
Well, turn the lights off. So we've got to come to
that we've seen before. In other words, I don't know that we're going to be looking at states that will have new normalities like we may have expected them at one time. There's also a Cold War aspect to this, which I think is worth pointing out and keeping in mind. And this is the first time we've seen this in a number of years, at least since Russia has reemerged as a stronger, at least in pretension, player for the first time in 20 years. We now have a Cold War division taking place in a shooting war in the world. And that's one of the reasons why the West, in addition to hostility within Syria towards it, that it's not leaping in. There may be calls for it to help. How to help?
Right. Thank you. Will 2013 see an end to the conflict, Ausama Monajed?
I think it's possible, but the probability remains to be discussed. It's not certain. A lot depends on a deal reached between the US and Russia, allowing for a Security Council resolution to pass, and then Assad would completely change his position, or things on the ground would change completely different, or trends will escalate in different directions, and then people on the ground are not going to wait, neither for the US or Russia or anyone else.
Patrick?
I want to sympathize with our friend over there. Of course it's a genuine uprising. And I mentioned right at the beginning, disaffected peasants, unemployed youth, corruption in high places, privileges for the Alawis, the fact that the regime had been there for 40 years. Of course there was a genuine uprising. But unfortunately, both sides took to arms. And the mistake of the regime, as I said right at the beginning, was it resorted to live fire right from the beginning, which is a great mistake. And of course,
more than a mistake.
Well, whatever. We shouldn't be over-influenced by the humanitarian aspect. Of course, the humanitarian aspect is terribly important. But
I'm a Syrian.
I know that there's been killing and driving and so forth. But my own feeling is this: we need to stop the killing and save what's left of Syria. If you are a Syrian, you believe in Syria, Syria has a role, a regional role, quite apart from anything else. Who is containing Israel except for Syria? Now, once Egypt signed its peace treaty and once Iraq turns towards fighting Iran, only Syria And that role is deeply embedded in the Syrian army ideology. We mustn't forget that, and in the minds of all Syrian patriots. Now, a lot will depend on how the international struggle plays out. And I tend to believe now that the Russians and the Americans will soon come to the view that it's not in their interest that this struggle continues. And so you want me to stop?
Well, if you could come to a conclusion.
Well, my conclusion is that I think that this year, 2013, will see an end to this. I think that Assad's peace plan should not be dismissed completely, as many people say. People say he's a cancer and cancer. Don't forget that Syria had 30 years of stability when other countries had.
Okay.
Well, what about Iraq? What about Lebanon?
Right.
Country supporting, and I'm a Syrian Christian, by the way. I do not support the regime, and you spoke on my behalf, which I find quite rude. So
Right, but if you could bear with me, we were looking for closing comments, but if you can reach yours, Patrick.
Right, my last closing comment is this. Fortunately, somebody called Chuck Hagel may become the Minister of Defense in the United States. He doesn't want war against Iran. Israel will be contained, I believe, and this will help a great deal to resolve the Syrian crisis.
And to you, Melissa, you began by outlining a humanitarian crisis, and at the back of the room we heard people saying it's what worries them most. What would you like to say in conclusion?
Well, we wish that, today it's snowing in Jordan. Yesterday it was torrential, freezing rain. Many of you saw the pictures of the muddy tents. 30,000 people are sleeping in tents in the snow. These are people, we have teams at the border. Most people arrive at night because at night it's the safest to escape. We have stories of women who induce their pregnancy so that they can have their infant with them, because now was the time to flee and it was the safest time to cross the border. But we have accounts also of people being targeted as they flee. People arrive, they're injured, they have to be rushed to the hospital. They're taken to a camp. If this continues, it's been 2 years. You can stay in a camp for 1 month, for 2 months, for 3 months. I don't want to compare Syria with Somalia, but Somalia has been going on for 21 years, and we have 1 million people, Somali refugees outside. I think what will concern not only is that these people are suffering tremendously, but these are people who used to be teachers and doctors and shopkeepers and farmers, and okay, you have other groups that you named, but they're the fabric of the society of Syria. 50% are children, and 50% were in school, and they're no longer in those schools. They're in new makeshift schools and UNICEF schools, Save the Children's schools. Maybe they'll go and through primary school. The secondary schools and for Somalia kids stopped. Soon people start losing interest. Things move on. The money dries up. You made that point there. I do think one needs to look at the people and look at the people as the reason to stop the killing and to stop the conflict.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I think if a long time ago we began with your assessment of the refugee situation. We tried to talk about the regime and who the FSA were, the position of the international community. We heard from the floor to remember the people who are dying today, let alone the temperatures of refugees where they are in camps, but the killing that's going on. The disputes over the numbers, we heard as well who's the international community and whose side they're on, the role of, in the region, the role of religion and how it's misunderstood by people on stages in the West. And for all the contributions you made, if you didn't get them, I'm sorry. But thank you for being interrupted and for giving your disputed and different positions. Melissa Fleming, Patrick Seale, Ausama Monajed and John Lee Anderson. Thank you very much indeed.